and I'm delighted to be here and to talk a little bit about my work with you today. What I'm going to be presenting, though, is part of it comes from my work, and then the second half of it is something that it has extended out of the book and is something that I'm working on at the moment. So the second half is not really a finished project, and it includes a number of re-education videos. So I'll be interested to hear what your impressions are of that. But to start off with, we're going into post-war West Germany. And I say West Germany not because there wasn't West and East Germany per se yet, but I'm talking really about the Allied zone, the American zone in particular at the moment, because America and the British basically more or less took over the function of re-education in the Western zones, and that's a little bit what I'll be looking at. But I'll start with that wonderful citation from Hannah Arendt that is and I will quote it in its entirety here. "The most extreme slogan which this war has evoked among the Allies, that the only good German is a dead German," see, it was out of context, "has this much basis in fact. The only way in which we can identify an anti-Nazi is when the Nazis have hanged him. There is no other reliable token." And this is from an essay she wrote called Organized Guilt and Universal Responsibility, from 1945. So I'll just get started, but before I do, I just wanted to say that this particular image is from 1947, and it's from Life magazine, obviously, and there's two strapping American youth who are wearing German lederhosen, and it's very interesting because it also in the background we have Heidelberg, and you can see it's bomb ruins, and so it's interesting because actually the paper and what I'll be talking about tonight will be about the other way round. How do Americans make Germans behave like them, not vice versa? So I really thought this was an interesting image. So emotions are part of a social life world, which by definition means that they are also potentially political. Here, political does not refer to a literal engagement with traditional political forums such as party addresses or parliamentary discussions, although affect often plays a significant role in these venues too. Political in this context is defined in terms of how the norms and mores promulgated by a society impact its community. Norms of conduct or social structures often remain invisible to the individual, appearing to the subject instead as natural or as common sense. Forms of behavior seem to be natural or second nature to the subject because the individual has inhabited these norms from childhood onwards. Again, it is in moments of social crisis, the breakdown of business as usual, that norms reveal themselves as social expectations through the radical reconfiguration or even dissolution of the social environment in which they were rooted. This realization is prompted by a sudden awareness of an uncanny or even traumatic alterity in a familiar environment or situation, an alienation effect, if you will. That's a nod towards our class, Leslie. This alienation effect displaces the subject's point of view or makes the subject aware that they occupy a certain attitude towards the world in the first place. Arguably, the defeat of Germany was such a moment of revelatory crisis, and perhaps solely in this sense, the concept of 0 hour, which is usually used to depoliticize the moment, but it might actually be applicable in terms of capturing the shriveling of the norms and the moral and political vacuum in which Germany found itself at the very latest in May of 1945. The paradigm of emotion was part of the discourse of coming to terms with the past, which is a phrase now that gets used to describe how Germans have interacted with the Nazi past, their attitude towards it, how it's evolved over time, from its inception. Ranging from the observations made by Allied soldiers and journalists in the immediate post-war years to the highly charged and almost ritual debates these days about Germany's relationship to the past, and you can think in the 80s and the 90s there was the historians' debate, which was about relativizing the Holocaust or not, Nolte versus Habermas and so on. And then there was also, more recently, there was a scandal about the foreign embassy, Das Amt, which Peter Hayes, who was a historian on campus who's just retired, was part of that project of doing the intense research to show that, of course, the foreign ministry was involved in deporting the Jews. So this is why I say ritual, not to make it belittle it, but because sometimes it's quite clear that this would be the case, that there was this kind of involvement. But there seems to be always an uproar in the newspaper when something like this happens. So emotion has played a major role, you can argue then, from the beginning. Two emotional cultures in particular, though, have been central for scholars of post-war German culture, that of guilt and that of the so-called inability to mourn. And these are two different paradigms that are used to explore post-war Germany. The paradigm of the inability to mourn more or less argues it's from a book from 1967 by psychoanalysts Margareta and Alexander Mitscherlich, who basically brought psychoanalysis back to West Germany. And they argued basically that West Germans had not come to terms with the past and that they had exhibited an inability to mourn, that they were frozen. However, if you go back and look at the immediate post-war period, you see that this is not true. In fact, and if you explore and go into the archives they used and so on, that it's based on a case study of two patients. But they used it. It was more like a political mobilizing a slogan, because if you think it was 67, right, 68 student movement, etc. So it all came together in that way. However, in German studies up until the day, there are all these arguments that will criticize literature from a moral perspective because of its inability to mourn, which to me seems utterly anachronistic. But this paradigm has been very strong in German studies up until recently. So that's actually in the book what I'm taking issue with, that particular paradigm and extending it to other different kinds of emotion that I find in the text and in the scenarios I look at. Okay, so what I'll look at first is guilt, and then I will go on to talk a little bit about Allied re-education, and that's the less finished part. So in a publication from 1945 to 1946, critical theorist Leo Löwenthal wrote in broad strokes of the crisis of the individual through the breakdown of the continuum of the individual's experience in modern society, singling out Germany as a community thoroughly atomized by terror. He observes of the post-war German population, and I cite, "They admit the most atrocious crimes, but show not the slightest sense of guilt," and refers to the response of many Germans towards the Allied occupiers as that of a continuity of frozen reactions, end quote. Significantly, he attributes this frozen quality to the atomizing effects of political terror structure on individuals in a community, arguing that a terror regime acts upon individuals like a series of real or anticipated or unanticipated shocks, curtailing their ability to hope or genuinely feel, and reducing members of society to a state of infantile dependency. And this particular writer was part of the Frankfurt School. He was Jewish and he was in exile in America when he wrote this. Likewise, in 1950, during a visit to Germany, German Jewish exile and political theorist Hannah Arendt, and now we're coming back to her, reflected on this lack of emotion. This is a later publication though. And I cite from her, "This apparent heartlessness, sometimes covered over by cheap sentimentality." And again from her, "A lack of response is visible everywhere, and it's difficult to say whether this signifies a half-conscious refusal to yield to grief or a genuine inability to feel," which also in some ways is interesting because it predates the Mitscherlichs and they do not refer to this essay either, which seems the strange omission. Importantly, Arendt's report manifests an uncertainty at the level of reading emotion, an oscillation before the hermeneutics of emotional intersubjectivity, and thus indicates the complexity or at times even opacity of post-war affective structures. So she's having difficulty reading basically what's going on. The assumption driving Arendt's and other early accounts about post-war Germany appears to be that if one could read emotions clearly, they might reveal something important about the moral state of German civilians. Re-education, conceptualized largely as a psychosocial and cultural task, demanded a well-tuned sense of public opinion if democratization were to be successful. This included fostering newspapers and promoting films aimed at the German audience, ostensibly on the basis of their potential, the film's potentials to indoctrinate democracy through positive representations of the American way of life. Post-war accounts seldom omit an account of the emotional disposition of the Germans, either in connection with, for their most part, miserable living conditions, without food and adequate shelter amongst the rubble, or in a more political vein, as a measure of the country's roux and self-reflexivity. In 1946, Stig Dagerman, a Swedish author who was assigned to report on post-war life in defeated Germany for the Swedish newspaper Expressen, crafted a strikingly perceptive and unusually empathic account of his first-hand observations of Germans, and his book is called Germany in Autumn. It's really, I think, quite a unique book in this particular genre of writing. This clear-sighted, sensitive, and at times almost tender account gauges personal and political stakes by suspending moral judgment while observing a complex and self-conscious language of effective gestures, as well as acknowledging the suffering of those living among the rubble. And I cite now, it's a slightly longer quote from Dagerman. If any commentary is to be risked on the mood of bitterness towards the Allies, mixed with self-contempt, with apathy, with comparisons to the disadvantage of the present, all of which were certain to strike the visitor that gloomy autumn, it is necessary to keep in mind a whole series of particular occurrences and physical conditions. It is important to remember that statements implying dissatisfaction with, or even distrust of the goodwill of the victorious democracies, were made not in an airless room or on a theatrical stage echoing with ideological repartee, but in all too palpable cellars in Essen, Hamburg, or Frankfurt am Main. It is a kind of blackmail to analyze the political leanings of the hungry, without at the same time analyzing hunger. For hunger is a form of unaccountability, not just physical, but also a mental state that leaves minimum space for the leisure of thought. This meant that one naturally heard things which sounded most unattractive, but which nevertheless gave one no right to make cocksure prognoses, end quote. So Dagerman's account is striking in that it avoids passing moral judgment on the cynicism and apathy he observes among the German civilians. The starkness and honesty of his writing convey all the more vividly the complexity of the Germans' emotional state at this bleak historical moment. And the moment I'm talking about is basically 45 to around about 50. After that, Germany entered into a different state. Well, it became a state again in 1949. So this is a very short window of time that I'm analyzing tonight. Likewise, American philosopher William Ernest Hocking understood the complicated semantics of the apparent reluctance among the post-war German population to speak openly about their situation. Of the military defeats and subsequent trials, he writes in 1954, and I cite again, their total effect, appalling and irresistible, drove the impulse of words, whether for thought or feeling, back into reticence. A reticence which many a dull observer mistook for solidity or indifference. It was just the reverse, end quote. Still, the much alleged failure to exhibit any appropriate measure of emotion of roux via easily legible signs led to the production of the stereotype of the cold, hard, unfeeling German that we encounter time and again in post-war literature and newspaper headlines, such as those cited above. Addressing the obstacles to expressing appropriate emotions in the post-war moment, Hocking, and this is the same person I just cited, questions the desire of the journalistic or reformer's gaze that seeks signs of repentance and of emotional suffering. And I'm citing from Hocking again. Among the afflictions which the German public had to endure during the first years of recovery was the pest of repertorial investigators seeking signs of remorse. It is hard to say just what they were expecting to find, whether some modern version of sackcloth and ashes, or at least a prevalent physiognomy of contrition. In any case, not finding it, they raised the question whether Germany was being sufficiently punished. They could not understand that the only sign that could concern us was a sign that serious thinking was going on. How else can a deep-going emotional crisis reach its settlement except through long-continued labor of thought? And this is something that philosophers such as Adorno also echoed later on in their works. Hocking recognizes the intertwinement of affect and critical thought, as well as the time necessary for the work of affect and the maturation of thinking. In the wake of the Allied politics of defeat and punishment, Hocking argues, Germans did not evince an inability to feel so much as a flood of overwhelming affect that needed to be kept at bay. Thus, expressions of discrete emotional signals may have been eligible to the observer or obscured by conflicting emotions. And I'm citing one last time from Hocking. It was the free-thinking process stirred by defeat and court, and those are both capitalized in his account, unhurried, unobserved, profoundly passion-filled, that chiefly affected whatever change took place. They were the persistent backdrop to the stage of our specific activities, of which, on the negative side, denazification was most certainly the most remarkable." End quote. So Duckerman and Hocking both argue that emotions may be illegible and remain unarticulated, although, or even because, they are part of a complex affective and even reflective structure. Accounts such as these act to complicate the ritual condemnation of a post-war inability to feel or express emotions through appropriate speech, comportment, or gestures. And I'm just going to show you if we have success with the technology, always a challenge. I just want to show you a short clip from a film that was made in 1946. It's called The Death Mills. I don't know, has anyone seen this at all? It's not very nice. You can imagine a film called The Death Mills, made by the Allies, the British and the American Allies. And it was made as a film, and it's part of a genre of what has come to be known both within the scholarship and also just around as the so-called atrocity films, which are basically representations of the Holocaust, at its most bleak. And a lot of these films also have a voiceover that is done in a particularly pedagogical fashion and with a certain kind of punitive intent. And I wanted to show you just a little bit of that. I wanted to show you the sequence where they have actually filmed the people from Weimar, who they have got to walk from Weimar down to the Buchenwald concentration camp, and their responses. And it's very interesting to see the images, because actually it was in German, so the voiceover was put on top of it, so that people in England and America could understand what was going on in the film. And at first these films were shown in cinemas to Germans. Germans were forced to go to them, and then they did some surveys and so on. And then they realized very quickly that this was just not really a very effective approach, that people were really recoiling rather than actually dealing with any of this. And it didn't make for an honest response either, obviously. So they stopped doing that, but they moved into a different genre of film, which was called Welt im Film, which is world in film. And these films that they made were educational films, and they were more in the vein of democratization and re-education. And I'm going to show you some of those later on, just little small clips from them. And they're meant to show you how to be a good Democrat, so they're much more upbeat. One of them that I'll end with is even meant to be very funny, I think you'll see.
At Weimar, all citizens were ordered to visit the concentration camp. They were called from their homes, assembled in the streets, and marched off. They started the trip as though they were going on a picnic. After all, it was only a short walk from any German city to the nearest concentration camp. But there was no picnic behind the barbed wire. Death was the only one who had feasted here. Each and every one had been murdered on orders of the Nazi High Command. But these Germans, the ones who said they didn't know, were responsible too. They had put themselves gladly into the hands of criminals and lunatics. They tell you now they meant no evil, that they knew nothing of what was going on, or could do nothing even if they knew. The farmers received tons of human ash as fertilizer. but apparently never suspected it came from human beings. The manufacturers received tons of human hair, but apparently never dreamed it came from the heads of murdered women. No nightmares ever haunted those who lived near concentration camps. The cries and moans of the tortured were no doubt believed to be the wailing of the wind. Yesterday, while millions were dying in concentration camps, Germans jammed Nuremberg to cheer the Nazi Party and sing hymns of hate. Today, these Germans who cheered the destruction of humanity in their own land, who cheered the attack on helpless neighbors, who cheered the enslavement of Europe, plead for your sympathy. They are the same Germans who once hailed Hitler. Remember, if they bear heavy crosses now, they are the crosses of the millions crucified in Nazi death mills.
Okay, I think that's the first time you've seen it, then it's probably quite shocking. If you watch it quite a few times, you see the kind of pedagogical moves that are being made and the kind of conflation of different kinds of things together, such as at the end we have the superimposition of the Nazi Nuremberg rally, and on top of it we have the Germans from Weimar, and there are some very large statements that are made about what these people did. They never had nightmares, etc. So this was the original response of the Allies, as you might understand, because they were very shocked when they came to the concentration camps and saw the horrible things they did. Sorry, just one sec. And I just wanted to show you as well, coming back to the, oh, there we are. I just wanted to show you, this was actually, I'm about to talk about this. This was actually a placard that went up in a lot of German cities straight after the Allied forces and the journalists, they were accompanied by a large flotilla of journalists, had been to the camps. They started making these placards and putting them up in towns all around Germany, and they sort of just came from nowhere. Okay, so most viewers would have no trouble recognizing the photos by Allied journalists of the atrocities in the liberated concentration camps, even if these images address viewers now in a vastly different manner than they did their post-war German counterpart. After the German defeat, the Allies used a constellation of images and documentary footage to stage what I call a primal scene of denazification. Here, Germans came face to face, often for the first time, with images of emaciated survivors, serialized corpses, and mass decay from concentration camps. Through their wide reproduction and circulation, these images have become what Cornelia Brink terms icons of extermination, because we actually know what they are almost as soon as we see them, right? They're very familiar in the Western world anyway, and especially in American context. But the focus on the images alone does not tell the full story. Indeed, this may lead to an anachronistic interpretation based on more current norms and values than the historical context of the image's reception. The scene's insistence on the visual register, a central element also of the Freudian primal scene, is underscored and complicated by the existence of additional photography and film footage of the German spectators of this material taken by the Allies. So you actually, in some films, you will see the Germans looking at these particular placards. So it's interesting. It's a scene of, double spectatorship, so to speak. And there's a lot going on there in that relationship. Thus, for many post-war German viewers, the initial reaction of shock might also have been coupled with an acute awareness of their exposed visibility to the Allied audience of re-educators. In his Schuldfrage, which is translated into English as the question of German guilt, and it was given as a series of lectures originally, in his Schuldfrage lectures, Karl Jaspers, a philosopher, he'd stayed in Germany, he had a Jewish wife, and he and his wife basically stayed in Heidelberg. He was dismissed from the university because he was in a marriage with a Jewish woman, and they basically held out throughout the entire Nazi period, and were very worried at the end that they might be deported. And they actually found out later that the Allies had arrived in Heidelberg 15 days before they were scheduled actually to be shipped out, or deported east. And so they were. This is someone talking. I'm just giving you that background so that you know that this is someone talking from a particular position and not just some German academic who had a cushy job during the war. It's not that. So he refers to just such an Urszene of photos and captions in these actual lectures that he gave in 1945, 1946 at the University of Heidelberg. And these captions here are from the Belsen concentration camp, and they were placed on display by the Allied forces in towns and villages across Germany in the summer of 1945. He criticized the heavy-handed tactics of the US occupation forces for accompanying texts such as "Das ist eure Schuld," which is what this says here, eure Schuld. This is your fault, or you are guilty of this. Disapproving of these shock tactics, he feared that rather than the hoped-for effect of the recognition by German citizens of their guilt and political liability for the Nazi regime, the postings instead solicited a reaction of defensive disavowal, which they actually did. Everyone was like, oh, we didn't know, we didn't see, we didn't know, a shock reaction. The knowledge that people had was often very partial as well, so it's not an excuse, but it was, I think, a really kind of a mixed bag of experiences that were brought to with the people who viewed these images. In his view, what is uncanny about the posters is their lack of attribution of a source for the postings. And he says, I'll just read the English. Consciences grew uneasy. Horror gripped many who had indeed not known this, and something in them rebelled. Who indicts me there? No signature, no authority. The poster appeared as if emerging from empty space. For Jaspers, guilt was a limit state that requires an addresser and an addressee, even if ultimately the subject and their conscience form the partnership in that particular dialogue. He worked in existence philosophy, so he has a particular take on this, an existential take on this, that involves a theological slant as well. In the most extensive study of the atrocity films and their recognition and their reception to date, Ulrike Weckel, a German historian, examines the documentation of German reactions on encountering the scene in its staging in films screened across Germany, in the Nuremberg trials, and also for German prisoners of war who were interned in Allied camps. Shifting the focus to the German viewer of the images, because usually the focus has been on the people producing them quite often. Ulrike Weckel calls these shaming images, beschämende Bilder, images that should cause shame, arguing for the primary role of shame rather than guilt in the visual register in these post-war primal scenes. The staging of this photographic display can be read simultaneously as an attempt to ignite repulsion for the Nazi dictatorship in German citizens, as well as a harsh pedagogical measure fully in line with the Allied goals of denazification, which was their priority at the time. A broad spectrum of visible responses was possible, and if spectators did not manifest emotions or bodily gestures, it did not necessarily mean they were left unaffected. And this is Ulrike Weckel's extensive research that she's done on these films and their reception, which is just an incredible amount of research, very interesting. Indeed, after shock, the first response was often an involuntary recoiling back on the self that might indicate a defensive posture or be a sign of shame. Reading for emotions in this and similar scenes from the period is further complicated by the multivalence of gestural and verbal articulations. This is a potent specular scene. The German population is caught looking at images, in turn aware of the critical gaze aimed at them by the soldiers of the occupying forces who have staged the encounter with these images and the accompanying accusatory captions in US-occupied towns across Germany. The model of intersubjective response of these spectators captures the dynamic of emotional reflexivity, the way in which certain emotions demand in turn an emotional response. emotional intersubjectivity and emotional reflexity, or affect responding to affect, become particularly important in situations of crisis that demand an ethical response from an individual. This approach to reading for emotions enables us to glimpse some of the affective structures prevalent in post-war West German culture in the immediate period when denazification was more important than re-education. Guilt, perhaps the most volatile and salient public political feeling in the immediate post-war years in Germany, that was guilt. Salient because the Allied victors expected this to be the appropriate response in the face of the crimes of the Third Reich. Volatile because the defeated population was a constituency defined by the heterogeneity of their experiences during the past 12 years, which influenced their effective responses to the aftermath of National Socialism in unpredictable ways. And I'm coming back to Karl Jaspers and his series of lectures that he held on the question of guilt when Heidelberg University was denazified and reopened for the semester of 1945 and 1946. And he was instrumental in that. Otherwise, it wouldn't have probably happened. These lectures were published in 1946 as The Question of German Guilt in America, and Hannah Arendt helped that process to happen. And in the book, he actually identifies and analyzes 4 categories of guilt and formulates his own philosophical answers to the German question. And the 4 categories are criminal, political, moral, and metaphysical. So these are in part, of course, analytical distinctions made by Jaspers that enable him to differentiate between different moral and political registers of guilt and liability. And in the book, I actually analysed the book and its reception, and also the fact that he was in a lecture hall filled with returned veterans, and so he was walking a tightrope of not showing his own emotions and shame in the situation. And I found different forms of reception that enabled me to sort of reconstruct different kind of effective responses that were happening in the hall, and that was really very interesting. And also the fact that he left Germany in 1948 to take up a position in the University of Basel in Switzerland, because he said it was the position, but of course it was much more than that. And when I was in the archives, I found a whole lot of hate mails, hate and postcards and so on. That was really quite, that hasn't really been published before. It was horrible. So the conditions under which emotions are recognized and judged as morally appropriate or inappropriate are largely provided by a set of pre-existing norms on which any given society relies to interpret and navigate its lived environment. These emotional norms make up our emotional habitus and are negotiated through and regulated by social interactions between individuals, including emotional intersubjectivity in relation to larger institutions. For Jaspers, trained psychiatrist turned philosopher, post-war US Allied re-education meant more than the strict supervision and control of educational institutions, in his case that being Heidelberg University. It also meant adherence to the initially harsh original version of the Joint Chief of Staff Directive, which was 1067 or 1067, issued by the American military government before the defeat of Germany. And there's a whole story of what was going on there in terms of the research and the spying and so on, that they were setting up an approach to Germany already way in advance of, before they knew that they would be able to defeat Hitler. So this is also interesting, and that was all on American soil. The original wording of this infamous Allied directive in its most punitive incarnation included the phrase collective guilt, but this was removed from the document within a week of its application, as the phrase was deemed to be detrimental to the process of fostering democratic values in defeated Germany. The window of opportunity for re-education was very narrow. It lasted approximately 3 years, 1945 to 1948, and its demise was determined as much by external factors as by the German people's apparent unwillingness to engage with the consequences of either fostering or, in other cases, not actively opposing National Socialism. This attitude, coupled with the fear of confronting one's own immediate past, ultimately helped thwart Allied and German attempts alike at denazification. Also, they realized it was a bureaucratic task that was way beyond the means that they had. And then the Cold War. Integral to this intended project of moral renewal, I argue, is what might be termed a re-education of the emotions, or a sentimental re-education, particularly concerned particularly with the most moral of emotions, namely that of guilt. Just as the question of German guilt runs parallel, the argument he makes in his lecture, to the discussion that he has in his correspondence with Hannah Arendt at exactly the same time. This particular conversation can be dated to when Jaspers read Arendt's prescient and original essay, Organized Guilt and Universal Responsibility, and that was the citation with which I began. It came from that essay, which was published in the US-American newspaper Jewish Frontier in January 1945, some 3 months before the Allied forces liberated Heidelberg. Arendt's argument concentrates on locating what she calls, and I cite the real political conditions, underlying the accusation of the collective guilt of the German population. She contests the common conflation of Nazis and Germans, stating that it overlooks the cynical Nazi strategies, such as that of the whispering campaigns, aimed at making the population complicit through their partial and uncertain knowledge of aspects of Nazi orchestrated violence and criminality. Thus, Arendt claims, everyone from those in positions of power to what she calls the family man, or less nice, I suppose, the Philistine, Spießer is the word in German, the new type of functionary who merely carries out duties to ensure the security of his private sphere, is implicated whether he wishes to be or not. As a consequence, per Arendt, it is virtually impossible to render justice, and I'm citing from her paper, where all are guilty, nobody in the last analysis can be judged. This returns us to the epigraph from Arendt with which I opened this chapter. Illuminating truth through her deployment of hyperbole, she claims that the only way to be sure of someone's innocence is when the Nazis have hanged the person. There's a grim truth in that. Unlike Jasper's lectures, Arendt's extraterritorial analysis, and by that I mean she wasn't in Germany, she had some distance from the place at this point, of the political structure of German guilt, was not reined in by caution, nor did it intend to deliver a moral message or to issue an appeal for responsibility to university students, whose reality for the past 12 years had been dominated by Nazi institutions and propaganda. In a sardonic reference to her essay, Arendt wrote to Jaspers that her contribution was less morally driven or punitive than many of the international German guilt debates raging during the war, and she's talking mostly about those in England and America. She claimed facetiously that her essay might act as a counterweight, as it were, ironically speaking, to the Morgenthau Plan. From her vantage point, Arendt was able to dismiss the myriad punitive suggestions of what should be done with Germany after the war, including the proposal to starve the Germans, or as the Morgenthau Plan proposed, and this was a plan that was put forward by Henry Morgenthau, who was the Minister of Finance at the time under Roosevelt. The plan was that Germany should be made to regress or allowed to regress to a pre-industrial society, that they would become an agricultural society again, because everything would be taken out that would enable them to ever be used doing industry again. This was considered for a very little while, not for long, in America. He found Roosevelt's ear for that. Obviously he was Jewish, and he was also very, very upset about what was happening in Germany. So Arendt argued that such action against the German people would simply mean that the ideology of the Nazis had won, implying that the Allies would then have carried out the promise of the Nazis by demolishing the population, just as Hitler had threatened to do so to save national face should Germany lose the war. So you can't win, basically, in that argument, is what she's saying. Jaspers obviously saw the value of introducing Arendt's perspective on the topic to a broader German audience and published a translation of her essay in Die Wandlung, which was a new post-war newspaper that lasted precisely until the West German state was grounded, ironically, and it was very, very radical in many ways. Karl Jaspers was also on the editorial board. Members of the reading public in Germany did actually view her text as something akin to a German defense against the Morgenthau Plan, which is exactly what she had feared. Horrified, Arendt wrote in a letter to Jaspers, and I cite, "I'm not altogether happy about the reaction to my guilt article. I'm getting letters from Germany. These people all feel so well understood, and none seem to have picked up on my bias against the Philistine. On top of that, the wretched Hessische Nachrichten, Hessen is an area in Germany, the Hessen News, has declared that I am, and this is in inverted commas in the original, I am Germany in the finest sense. The disturbing and inappropriate instrumentalization of that final comment was not lost on Arendt. In Arendt's essay, emotion appears to be the precondition for politics. Even if her deployment of emotion in this capacity remains underdeveloped, it seems safe to say that she does not develop a politics of emotion, or perhaps even regard emotion as political in this particular essay, and I think throughout her work more or less too. Rather, emotion appears to be the necessary but not sufficient condition for politics. In other words, emotion is something that is pre-political. Further, emotion is usually mentioned and then quickly sublated into the structure of the political as an unnoted prerequisite for political motivation. However, Arendt often mobilizes affect at the rhetorical level in her texts. For instance, in her writing, she practiced what Jaspers referred to euphemistically as her visionary capacity, evinced through her use of startling metaphors, unexpected analogies and hyperbole to jolt thought and provoke a response from her readers. And now just briefly, I am heading towards the end. I wanted actually to show you just two short clips that are taken from the re-education films, the Welt in Film, World in Film, the ones that were always shown. These were newsreels that were shown before every single film that was screened in Germany between 1946-7 to the mid-50s. It stopped, I think, being produced in 1952. And I'd be interested to hear afterwards what you make of these. And these are excerpts out of larger films.
Wisst ihr überhaupt, dass die Diskussion aus Amerika kommt?
Aus Amerika? Das ist mir neu. Mit Sicherheit wurde die Kunst der Diskussion bereits 2000 Jahre vor der Entdeckung Amerikas geübt.
Der Diskussionsleiter muss wie ein Dirigent dafür sorgen, dass sein Diskussionsorchester nicht durch Missklänge gestört wird. Er muss die Trompeten dämpfen, muss der zarten Harfe Gehör verschaffen und er darf auch keine privaten Duette erlauben. Sondern er muss durch eine unauffällige und zurückhaltende Leitung dafür sorgen, dass unter Beteiligung aller Teilnehmer die Diskussion fließt und das Thema wie ein Ball von Stimme zu Stimme weitergegeben wird. Auf keinen Fall darf ein Teilnehmer die Führung an sich reißen und die übrigen nicht zu Worte kommen lassen.
Nein, nein. Die Diskussion ist kein Mittel, um endlich mal den Lehrern eins auswischen zu können. Sie bedeutet aber auch nicht den Anfang vom Ende und die Auflösung von Zucht und Ordnung. Oder reine Zeitvergeutung und Spielerei. Im Gegenteil, sie ist ein Erziehungsmittel, das an vielen Schulen mit gutem Erfolg angewandt wird. Warum nicht auch bei Ihnen? Denken Sie immer daran, dass eine Diskussion nicht den Sinn hat, die Volksmeinung auszurichten oder gleichzuschalten, sondern sie soll alle Seiten eines Problems so beleuchten, dass jeder ein...
Okay. That's one version of a discussion re-education video, which was framed in a larger video, a larger film, sorry, that was about a larger topic. So these were all these little excerpts that were part of larger stories, not necessarily all put together in a narrative form either. They were often quite disjointed. And this one is that the one? No, we just had that. This one. This was in a film, this one, however, was extremely pedagogically openly, so it was called Lernen diskutieren, learn to discuss. So.
Öffentliche Diskussion über das Thema die Gleichberechtigung der Frau. Heute Abend 20 Uhr im Rathaussaal. Lernen Sie diskutieren. In der Diskussion können auch Sie...
Ich protestiere. Wieso fordern wir? Sie vielleicht, ich nicht. Ich bin dafür, dass es so bleiben soll, wie es war. Nicht wahr, Otto?
Meine Herrschaften, wir wollen doch wirklich nur die Gleichberechtigung der Frau diskutieren.
Gleichberechtigung der Frau? Wer spricht denn von der Gleichberechtigung der Männer? Das ist schon 3 Jahre lang ab. Hacke Holz.
So ein Unsinn. Öffentliche Diskussion. Da
Dabei kann ja nichts herauskommen. Das habe ich mir doch gleich gedacht. Wer kann denn schon diskutieren? Etwa diese da? Diese Dauerredner?
Glauben Sie nicht, dass es nur daran liegt, dass die Menschen im Saal einfach nicht wissen, wie sie sich verhalten sollen? Man muss ihnen einmal die Spielregeln geben.
Aber was nützt es, wenn ein geschulter Diskussionsleiter einer ungeschulten Menge gegenübersteht? Dann sind doch Spielregeln wertlos.
Spielregeln sind nur die Außenseite. Man muss den Menschen natürlich erklären, warum sie sie anwenden sollen. Denn es handelt sich bei der Diskussion doch nicht so sehr um die Anwendung einer neuen Technik, als vielmehr um eine neue Geisteshaltung.
Schrecklicher Gedanke. Wahrscheinlich ein neuer Ismus, etwa Diskussionismus. Ja, nicht schlecht, Diskussionismus.
Aber im Ernst, meine Herren, es geht doch hier nicht um einen grundsätzlich neuen Gedanken oder gar einen neuen Ismus, sondern nur um die praktische Anwendung einer alten, leider in Vergessenheit geratenen Idee, der Toleranz.
Okay, so you can see there's humor in them, but they're pretty heavy-handed. It's not probably going to get you quickly involved in the process of learning to discuss. And also what's very interesting as well is how it's always gendered. The person who teaches you how to discuss is always a very nice, gentle woman who is teaching you tolerance and to direct like an orchestra leader. I think that's So this is just a short section on re-education, and I'm going to end with another one of these little video film clip vignettes as well. I think it's the best of the lot, so you'll have something to laugh about at the end after all of this heavy stuff. General Lucius Clay, governor of the US zone, understood both the humanitarian and political toll that starvation would take on the German people and focused on securing food for the population of the zone over all other political agendas. In June 1945, Major General Morrison Steyer, chief medical officer for the American military government, received approval from Clay to conduct a survey of public health and medical care needs for the Germans in the US zone, thus effectively using a disease and unrest clause to override the original punitive intentions of the US occupation policy that I mentioned before. Clearly, the expectations on which this direction were based and the actual situation in Germany were incommensurable. Steyer justified his survey by describing the misery he observed, and I cite from his report, disorganization, desolation, starvation, and sickness, and he also noted an increase in the amount of suicides. This is 1945. Under these circumstances, many Germans were incapable of hearing and on other occasions outright resistant to even the most benevolent calls for moral introspection. So I'm returning now to the figure of William Hawkins because and his reflections in his book Experiment on Germany on Re-Education. After taking a tour of occupied Germany and attending sessions of the war crime courts in Nuremberg in 1948, American philosopher Ernst William Hawkins published a critical account of the US-American occupation's attempt at denazification and democratization of the German population in the West Zone. Titled Experiment in Education, the book was published in 1954 and makes a claim to an overview of what we can learn through teaching Germany, addressing the pedagogical efforts in the US occupation forces in Germany, and even offering an interpretation of the metaphysical dimension of politics in the nascent international post-war order. Don't worry, I'm not going there. In the post-war German context, Hawking takes issue with the simultaneously unqualified and overdetermined concept of democracy, and I'm citing from his text. I'm thinking of the deep and radical unfinishedness of our reflections about democracy, and therefore of the profound, perhaps insuperable difficulty of conveying a faith in which we ourselves are not entirely sure or clear, which is quite an amazing statement in this context. In the context of the US occupation, the concept of democracy covered more than the organization of a political system alone, clearly. Hawking understood that the at times unruly behavior of the US military forces, for instance, could be taken by the German population as a measure of the fallibility of democratic values in the broader context of re-education towards democratic norms of emotion and comportment, and I cite from Hawking again. Whatever we had to say about democracy, our democracy would be judged chiefly by what we did. Every political and legal practice of ours would be examined with care by the Germans subject to it, to discover what, in terms of social action and of respect for personality, we meant by the term democracy, end quote. So in addition to legal and institutional reform at all levels of German society, re-education appears to encompass technologies of comportment or public behavior that rely on a performative dimension, where it is implied that democracy may even be learned through mimetic practices. And I cite from him again, from Hocking. We had an affirmative program. We thought of it in simple terms. We were recommending democracy. We were going to illustrate democracy rather than define it and explain it as we went along. This show not tell approach, suggested by Hocking, encompasses the language of emotions and also a syntax of behavior. Thus, it is sometimes seen as less obvious as a technology of democratization than institutional changes implemented by the military government. Specifically, Hocking recognizes the central role of emotion in training toward democracy when he states, emotion must be a part of any effective moral pedagogy, end quote. And moral pedagogy is most effective, Hocking ventures, when it is affective. That is, when it encompasses an emotional dialectics between negative and positive feelings. And I cite from Hocking's one more time. The punitive spirit, on its emotional side, has a swift and passing importance as part of the experience that must enter the dialectic of the moral learner. As indefinitely prolonged, it has its consummation in the ancient theological invention of eternal retribution. But no one considers hell an educational institution. Its inhabitants, if any, are God's personal failures, end quote. In case of the US occupation of Germany, the path beyond the hell of defeat seemed to be paved with the good intentions of democratic rehabilitation. So I'm actually going to finish off now, and these are the parts that I've just started working on more with these particular videos. And I just really wanted to, with all of the citations, give you some sense of the different kinds of discourses and the different kinds of topics and exchanges that were going on, very fleetingly, obviously, and that concern me also in my book, but from a much more emotional, moral perspective than I've really done tonight. So I'm left with some questions, and these would mainly be, can a population or a community actually be taught to feel and act differently through an externally imposed political, cultural paradigm? How is a certain kind of political subjectivity fashioned, and how are emotions engineered at a national level? Which prejudices and national stereotypes are at work in imagining a population's political behavior and attitudes? And there was a lot of that going on in America before the Allies came over. More specifically, what role is played by emotions in socio-political pedagogy, such as that informing German re-education? How are emotions engineered for a vehicle for, as well as a constitutive part of moral and political learning? Which technologies of pedagogy are engaged to produce the right thinking and feeling in a political subject? What kinds of unexpected feelings, at odds with behavioral norms and expectations of the educator-observer, might emerge from the collision of vastly different geopolitical entities and historical and cultural orientations of a target population and its re-educators? And pertinently, how might feelings manifest themselves in the target culture ostensibly undergoing the process of democratic inculcation? And because I wanted to end on a sort of happy note, I am going to show you one more of the excerpts from these re-education videos. Where are we now? Ach, yeah. This is one about how bureaucracy has changed in Germany. Your word in God's ear, as they say in German. I'm not really sure if that's true. Here we go. What is happening? Try again.
Verzeihung, ich wollte nur mal fragen, ob man hier...
Verdammt nochmal! Nicht mal zu den wichtigsten Amtsgeschäften kommt man hier. Wie soll man hier fertig werden, wenn das Publikum nicht die einfachsten Rücksicht nimmt? Also... Ach, ich begrüße Sie nicht. Ich will Ihre Anwendung haben.
anmelden. Ich will ja nur Auskunft, wenn ich nämlich auf dem Bauamt, ob ich dann erst hier...
Wie sind Sie überhaupt reingekommen?
Ja, ganz einfach.
Hier kommt man nicht ganz einfach rein, hier wird angemeldet und zwar schriftlich. Fräulein Nöte, eine Aktnotiz. Sollten derartige Verstöße nicht ausgeschaltet werden, wird für eine geregelte Abfertigung Gewähr mit R natürlich nicht gewährt werden können. Punkt.
Solche Beamte gibt es nicht. Wir sind uns wohl im Klaren. Bürokratie und Amtsherrschaft sind Dinge, die mal waren. Jedoch, mal hier, mal da, steht hinter einem Schalter doch noch ein Typ von ehedem. Ein stehengebliebener Alter. Auch andere Fälle kommen vor, verehrtes Publikum. Und damit Sie auch das mal sehen, drehen wir den Spieß jetzt um.
Ja, bitteschön. Oh ja, da kann ich Ihnen helfen hier. Ich werde gleich mal das Hauptamt anrufen, dann können Sie es da gleich abholen.
Also jetzt platzt mir aber der Kragen. Hören Sie mal, Beamter, seit 10 Minuten geben Sie sich jetzt nur mit diesem Herrn hier ab. Unser einer ist wohl ein Dreck, was?
Den Eindruck haben Sie nur selber.
Ach so. Reden darf man ja wohl nicht, wie? Hat sich wohl noch nicht herumgesprochen, dass wir eine Demokratie haben, hä?
Ah, meine Herren.
Oder ist man hier vielleicht nicht der letzte Dreck? Da reg ich mich auf! Da brüll ich! Verstehen Sie?
Natürlich verstehe ich. Sie brüllen ja.
Und weil Sie brüllen, werden wir eben nicht fertig.
Fertig werden. Daran liegt mir jetzt nichts mehr. Ich will mich beschweren. Wo kann man sich hier beschweren?
Das sage ich Ihnen gleich, wenn ich endlich das Telefongespräch geführt habe und wenn Sie an der Reihe sind.
Und ich mache nichts. Und ich verlange Höflichkeit. Und ich verlange Dienst am Kunden. Und ich verlange demokratisches Benehmen. Und ich poche auf mein Staatsbürgerrecht. Jawohl, ich poche! Ich poche!
Okay. With that, I would like to complete my talk tonight, probably with the question of how is that supposed to re-educate someone, but yeah. So I just thank you very much for listening and for being so patient with all of the different steps of it. Thank you. Yeah.
I got a question. So regarding your first question, this might be a bit off topic, but do you think that's perhaps why the Rwandan case of genocide, like the reconciliation has been, I guess, a better process because it wasn't imposed by outsiders, but sort of internally conceived?
I think probably in part also that, and I'm thinking also of South Africa, right, and the Truth and Reconciliation Tribunal. I do think that it seems to have in some cases worked better, yeah, and there seems to have been, but it's hard to say because I'm not an expert on Rwanda and the Tutsi and the Hutu and the different kinds of complications that go on there. But it seems to me like maybe other countries have learned from this. But clearly, obviously, there are still American re-education programs that go on in Iraq and other places. So it would be interesting. I'm quite sure that the kind of videos that get shown now probably don't look quite like this, I'm hoping anyway. But yes, that would be very possible, I think, yeah. But that's not to say that there weren't people in Germany either who weren't involved in this. There was a large amount of people in the population who really wanted denazification to take place. And then there were another huge group who wanted to basically thwart them. So so there was always these different forces in the population. But in general, I think really if it weren't for the Cold War, you know, this is that guessing game, that let's play the guessing game, what if, alternative futures. But if probably the stability that the Marshall Plan and the money that came pouring in gave Germany enabled it to actually achieve what it did achieve so quickly, rather than obviously these videos, right? Yeah. Yep.
I have a two-part question. Do we have samples or examples of where the process of turning Germany into a democratic society succeeded or failed? Do we have
examples?
Yeah.
Well, I think probably Germany today is the best example because it seems to be doing okay. But we do have, throughout the process, there were always moments of readjustment. And the things that I didn't talk about, I mean, it was a huge program, right? And there was also a really large portion of it that was devoted to re-educating the youth, because they were seen as, they were made into a danger group, right? They had only lived in this particular climate. They had grown up as Nazis. So all of the anxieties about the general population were projected onto the youth, and they had all these kind of camps where they would go and they would live in a democracy, and they all had to decide what they were doing. And you know, there's also some nice re-education video versions of those. But I do think that every single time one of these debates break out, that is what is being tested. And I also think that for example, with the historians debate, Germans were forced then to take sides again and to reiterate, you know, this was the moment at which Habermas said, Jürgen Habermas from the Frankfurt School said, this kind of patriotism is not okay. National patriotism is not okay. The only kind of patriotism you should have is to your constitution, for example. So there were all these, and that was in the 80s, there were all these moments that happened, and then some of the institutions that, you know, take off and really flourish. And there were also Konrad Jarausch, who is at the University of North Carolina in history there. He has done a lot of recent research about the American German exchanges, and that started up like with the Fulbright programs and DAAD and so on, and how they swapped teachers and they swapped all kinds of people, and that these networks are still in place. And in fact, why Germany still has so many foreign students, and the traffic between America and Germany actually comes from that impetus in post-war Germany. And that was one of the most successful things, but that was with individuals but the teachers as well. So yeah, it's hard to measure these things. I think that's exactly the problem. That's, you know, how do you do it? Surveys, yeah, they did try that, but you know, you can always lie on a survey. So it's very difficult when you're researching this, and this is exactly my problem, to try and see exactly, were these things taken up, how were they taken up, were they successful? The best way probably to go about it is to actually analyze what some of the different suppositions are and the assumptions that are coming out in the videos themselves. And also the whole section, well, a lot of stuff I left out, but there was also a large group in America that had sat down and made this big plan for a psychocultural approach, and Margaret Mead was part of it. It's this whole huge thing that happened from 43 through to 45, and the psychiatrist in charge of it wrote a best-selling book called Is Germany Incurable? So there were all of these fears and also projections that were going on, I think, on both sides, which was really interesting and made it very difficult, and makes it very difficult today to see exactly, you know, to measure that. Yeah. It's a good question. Thank you. Yeah, John.
This is such a fascinating talk, and I think such important questions. I loved when you referred to these films as a sentimental re-education, the nod to Stern there, and I was thinking about like different ways that we imagine culture teaching us. It actually made me think of Uncle Tom's Cabin, right? That at the very end of Uncle Tom's Cabin, when we're told that, you know, the whole project of abolition is learning how to feel the right way. And my question is how these forms of kind of state-produced culture coexisted alongside other kinds of cultural production. So you were saying that these re-education films, for example, were shown on cinema reels before other films. Did I get that right? Like you just go to the cinema and you'd see one of these before the main event. So do you have any sense of, like, you see this film before like some other like just Hollywood production, and what kinds of emotions the re-education film is eliciting, how they coexist alongside the kinds of emotions that the you know, Hollywood film are eliciting?
Yeah, no, there's actually some really good research that has been done on this. Johannes von Moltke, who is at University of Michigan, German and Film Studies, has written a book called No Place Like Home, where he looks at the German Heimat films, which were the most popular genre of post-war films in this really interesting period, the period that I'm most interested in, which is why this is I think such a fascinating period, is where people actually really were grappling with it between 45 and about 50, 51. After that, and there were all different kinds of films coming out that were about guilt and, and especially from East Germany, because they gave a film license to German filmmakers more easily, more quickly. And they made the first post-war German film was called The Murderers Are Among Us, for example. So there is this moment where there's this incredible cultural flourishing of things that seem very productive, even though they all have their things going on, nonetheless, blind spots. But into the 50s, there was this just sort of like, in the cinema anyway, this kind of, I don't know what you would call it, cultural amnesia. Is that snow? I'm sorry, I didn't notice that before. So, cultural amnesia, sorry about that. That was just suddenly, see, I was so intensely involved the whole time, I didn't notice. No, but basically the kinds of films that were being made from about 52, 54 onwards were called Heimat films, and they were very much about people, for example, I'm going to be really stereotypical, like the guy at the end that the Americans, set up as like the backward Bavarian, still Nazi behavior guy, right? Or still like authoritarian figure, right? Or authoritarian personality, as Adorno calls it. That kind of guy would be in a village, and there would be someone who would come from outside, and everyone would try and milden him a little bit, the authoritarian guy. And then something would happen, and the person who'd come from outside was evil, and then the person who'd come from outside had to be expelled from the village, and there were lots of hunting scenes, and they were they were really back at home with the blood and the soil, although blood wasn't mentioned, but it was very much about Heimat, which is literally translated as homeland, right? Which for us is a strange concept because we associate homeland with homeland security, I think, probably these days. I don't actually think of it much else. But so these films were really, really retrograde, basically, and they were completely apolitical. They could have been set almost in any time, and a lot of them look and just really, they're very, very invested in tradition, and the German film structure at the time was set up so that the people who had money were investing in these kind of films. So new filmmakers found it very difficult to break through until the 70s and the 80s, and then we get people like Fassbinder turning up, and then it all gets much better. So there were also American films being shown. Jennifer Fay has written a great book called Theatres of Occupation, where she talks about this. She also talks about how these films came from America. They were screened, right? Anything that had too much military in it was not allowed to be shown to the Germans, because there is this very, very strange, this is what I'm trying to get at. What are people thinking when they make these decisions, right? Why should they not watch military? Why should this be effective? So it's very interesting to try and get to the things behind this. But no, the American movies, they had a whole amount, and at first they weren't allowed, obviously there weren't any new German movies, so at first Hollywood flooded the market, which was also an economic initiative going on there. Selective film, but Hollywood really took over the market. And it really depended on the zone as well, right? But very soon America and Britain sort of came together, and France sort of let them do. The Americans were most invested in re-education. The French really didn't care, I don't think, and the British were really not invested in the same way. Probably also because of the Cold War logic that was going on between America and the Soviet Union. But these Hollywood films, as Jennifer Fay analyzes, a lot of them actually are not, they're really not films. They're meant to show you how things get better. There's a young guy who comes from Germany, he's adopted by an American family, he's a little Nazi, and they turn him around and everything is great. That's the most blatantly propagandistic one. But the other ones show things, for example, like Jewish people are involved in Greek and whatever, and all of the people who are not like white bread American basically have to go through a process of assimilation in order to be happy by the end of the film. And they were showing these films, right, in Germany, which is really, so basically the chauvinism they were angry, directed at the Germans was being repeated in these films in different ways, right? So that's really interesting to think about. So those are the two main examples I could give. But yeah, I think some people actually came late to the cinemas on purpose because, not surprisingly, but thanks for the question. Yeah, yeah, Brad.
Was there a Soviet corollary to this in East Germany?
Yeah, but it was also, the difference is that the film industry in East Germany set up its DEFA, the company, much quicker. And it also started making state-sponsored films very quickly. And the films themselves, like the mainstream films, were actually really so inflected with the socialist ideals, right? Not quite propaganda even, because there actually were moments in films in the former East where the films themselves were actually very critical, for example, of the Nazis, or very critical of something. So they were actually critical, but in other ways, then they would like heroize certain figures who were involved with the Soviet forces and so on. So I don't think they had not as long-lasting or a similar project, but I think it was actually incorporated in the films. And at first also, of course, films were coming from Russia, and that was also debated. I'm not so familiar with all of the arguments around the East, but I do know that, for example, things like Eisenstein's film, there were debates whether that should be shown or not, and so they weren't really interested in films that were avant-garde in a certain way. They really wanted them to be something that had a moral substance to it and an ideological substance too, but it was more state-run, I think. Yeah, hi.
In about 1960, James Cagney made a Hollywood film, filmed in Berlin, and dealt with the East and West Berlin, and was very funny. It was called 1, 2, 3.
Oh, Billy Wilder, yeah. Billy Wilder made that,
1, 2, 3, very funny film.
It's fantastic.
It's about East and West Berlin.
Yeah. You do know that actually he, I forgot to mention this, so I'm glad you've brought this up. It's a good point. He was Jewish, right, Billy Wilder, and he went into exile for obvious reasons. He was from Austria. And he went to Hollywood and stayed there. And at first they tried to bring him back to do some films. He also made A Foreign Affair. I don't know if you've seen that. That's from 46, 47. Has Marlene Dietrich as the big spy, the femme fatale, basically, who sings Black Market and so on. It's really quite an incredible film. And has a nice Ohio girl with her hair in plaits who, of course, wins against Marlene Dietrich. Likely. But Marlene Dietrich is, of course, an old Nazi in this film as well. But Billy Wilder also was involved in the making of the Death Mills. He often is given as, his name is given as the director of the film, but he actually wasn't the director. He did some of the shooting of the film, but he actually got the film and helped edit it. But I think the other people are so unknown that his name is associated primarily with this film. And of course, his parents died in the Holocaust, so he was, he was not going back, and he was not really so excited about the Death Mill films too. I think his involvement was then far less than they thought it would be. Yep.
So if you want a good laugh, I recommend 1, 2, 3.
Yeah, no, it's really worth, I'm with you on that one, definitely. And Foreign Affair, though, put them together. They're very good. You have the East-West divide, and you have the post-war German situation. Perfect. Hi.
Hi. I know this isn't the direct focus of your research, but I'm just curious, such deliberate emotional manipulation, how has that resonated through subsequent generations?
Well, I think this kind of, let me set it up with another example that really is so different from what is going on in this, to show you that the intellectuals at the time, and there were very different parties. Like the younger generation was very intent on being doing a Kahlschlag literature, which meant no adornment, no ornamentation in your writing, because only with no sort of fluff around it can you get at the truth, right? This was the idea, and realist cinema, and there was that movement. So they were off doing their own thing like that. But they were very critical of this as well, because it was just too bald-faced, right? And the other thing that I think was interesting is that there were a lot of people who were not happy about all of this, and maybe in public they behaved like the nice guy in the bureaucratic office, not the mean guy, but they were really fuming inside, and this became very apparent. I have a chapter in my book actually is on this. This was the most interesting thing I found out in the research. A man called Ernst von Salomon, who wrote a book, it was 800 pages long, called Der Fragebogen, the questionnaire, and he basically based it on the Allied denazification questionnaire, and he answered all the questions. He used it as it was basically a vehicle for his own like autobiography, but it was crazy. It was really over the top. He's a really good storyteller, so you go between thinking so obnoxious and this is so funny and so crazy. And then that's 2/3 of the book. The last third is called Remarks, which is also a category on the denazification questionnaire. And the last thing is about his internment in an Allied camp for people who were suspected of perhaps being dangerous, potential dangerous people who are on the so-called grey or black list. For example, Jaspers was on the white list. And he was interred there, and he basically said he wrote the entire autobiography there. And he was very angry. He said, "Why am I being interred? I'm not a Nazi." And he actually wasn't a Nazi, but he had been involved in the assassination of Walter Rathenau, which was he was the minister for the exterior, or whatever it was called back then, and Jewish. And his assassination was part of one of the things that really destabilized Weimar. So there probably was a reason that they suspected him, but in that whole thing, he is basically ranting and has as the aim of his hatred, basically, the Americans. And he does it in a very funny way, but it really is. And basically what I realized is that it was a structure of ressentiment that was going on there, and that there was this really deep vein of ressentiment. I started finding it everywhere I was looking. I basically went back to the newspapers at the time, and the word ressentiment was everywhere as well. So that the emotional structure, ultimately in the book I argued that the emotional structure was something like ressentiment amongst a lot of the population. And people loved his book, right? His book was the first right-wing bestseller in post-war Germany. The first round of 10,000 books was sold out immediately. The second run was sold out in advance. It's just crazy, and this was really an anti-American rave, like 1/3 of it. So people like that are not going to be reached by this at all. Nonetheless, they could have made a film about it and included it in this, I imagine. He went and they had this thing that they set up called the Kölner Mittwoch Gespräch, which was the Cologne Wednesday discussions, and it was set up by a bookstore owner in basically the main station of Cologne, the Hauptbahnhof, in a waiting room. And he thought like 20 people would come, and hundreds of people came, and they had to have different rooms. And Ernst von Salomon went up. He basically invited authors, directors, politicians, and Ernst von Salomon went there and argued, and it's really interesting because that was the first one they recorded, and I was able to listen to the recording, and people in the audience are really angry with him. On the other hand, when I looked in the archive, he had hundreds of letters from people saying, "I admire you, you're writing from my soul, I can hear myself in you, I'd love to sit by the fireside with you and talk about," these kind of letters. So there were so many different things going on, but I think people who were part of the intellectual scene were not really very easily swayed by this. They had other projects. They were involved in setting up new newspapers. They had to get licenses for these from the Allies, and so these were some of the things that were going on, I think. Yeah, no. I also wonder how anyone could, maybe through humor, I don't know.
Were there any films that were seductive, like in a very, re-education type of way? Because on the other side, like before the Holocaust. I think of like the Eternal Jew, which was actually a propagandic film, but very seductive, and people were very nostalgic about it, you know, versus more heavy-handed documentaries that would really try to, you know, sell, you know, Jews as like dirty rats and what have you. Do you know what I mean? So I'm just wondering if on the other side, if there was, you know, less heavy-handed, you know, entertainment that was more engaging.
I think probably they thought, and maybe it was, because I'm not really sure, I haven't looked at the reception of this, that this is something that is beyond the scope of this, but I think maybe those Hollywood films were in part that, you know, that they were meant to educate you into an American way of life, and you were meant to see how irresistible it was and how everyone in them was rich, and everyone, or, you know, rich, basically had a refrigerator and a car. That was rich at that point in time, or a house even, you know, in the German context, because so many people had lost everything. And cinema boomed. Like people, it didn't matter that even if you didn't have a home, you would still go to the cinema. Cinema and theatre was huge because there was really not much else to do, I don't think. And the newspapers were closed at first, and then there were allied newspapers. And so I think that kind of a film may have been more attractive. And one example of a film that I think probably does belong to that category, but it's one of those films, again, that will undermine itself nonetheless, is Ninotchka with Greta Garbo. That was one of the films that was deemed okay to show in Germany. The other ones that I've read about are not popular anymore, so I couldn't give them as an example, but that one was seen as something. But of course, that is also a Cold War film, right? So it's other stuff going on. But I have not yet seen but the thing is, this is also part of a genre, the re-education film, because if you look at the films that were being made at the time in Palestine, and also when Israel was first founded, there's a huge amount of films, and they are done in exactly the same tone. They have this pedagogical voice that comes over. I just saw recently at a conference, this is how I know this, someone who's working on sort of like pro-Zionist re-education films or education films from the time, and I said to her, this is remarkable because it's the same. Did they get the same man? Because it was the same kind of like. So it clearly was a genre, and I think it's in line with some particular idea of pedagogy, which probably is not very transparent to us anymore. And even at the time, people like Adorno were writing about education to autonomy or to maturity. And they were so much more sophisticated in what they were doing that this it didn't even register on the scale, so to speak. Yeah.
And would you say that films at that time of this, whether you're looking at the German film or the Zionist film, it was more okay to play to stereotypes. So we could never do a film with these types of stereotypes today.
No.
But in 1945, 47, 48, that type of stereotype would certainly be all right.
It is. I mean, this is true. And also if you think of, and just in Hollywood, right, as well, because if you think about Peter Lorre, that who was a Jewish actor who was in exile in Hollywood, and he basically played an Asian detective called Mr. Moto. And what he did was he had these little glasses, and all he did was go like this the whole time. And it was actually kind of dreadful because this guy actually was a really good actor. He was in M. He was the star of M. But he couldn't actually, you know, it was the kind of role that he got for some reason, because he was probably, so that sort of thing as well. It was just everywhere. No, today you wouldn't do that. Can you imagine, you know, casting someone in a role, you know, that just wouldn't happen, I don't think. You're right.
I think if I could just take up what we just discussed, I think it's probably we have more information and there's more inclusion, I think, globally, so the dialogue is much more open and honest and transparent, as you mentioned before.
No, I think you're completely right. The whole, like, what you could call globalization, perhaps, has really changed that, because, and this was also the case when you look at what people were working with for the psychocultural approach, as they said. I mean, they basically said, okay, Germany has a paranoid character, A paranoid character tends towards blah, 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 and ends in murder. And they anthropomorphize the entire German population in this way. This is in the book, Is Germany Incurable? There was another book that was called, but this one was so off the charts that it actually wasn't, I don't think, taken seriously. It was called Germany Must Perish, ! And it was written by, a Jewish, I think a salesman from Long Island, I think it was, called Theodor Kaufmann, and he just was so angry that he wrote this book and self-published it. But you can find some really amazing books, and of course there's Van Sittersen, which was Van Sittart, Lord Van Sittart in England wrote whole tracts, and he has a book called The Black Book, which is about how awful Germany is and how they should be eradicated. And so there really was this. And then on the other hand, there was a thing called, I'm forgetting the name of it, Psych War, S-Y-K-E, but I think it meant psych. It was written S-Y-K-E, those Psych War, where I got this book that was from the 40s, and it detailed how you should approach these things and how that you should basically think your way into the other person's skin, and you had to do this, and you had to use the BBC voice to win them over on the radio and it was really interesting, and emotions came up there a whole lot too. It was really very foregrounded. So yeah, I don't know. I think we probably do stereotyping in other places today still though, unfortunately. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.